welcome back. If you are new here, this channel explores the mythologies, deities, and ancient traditions that shaped the world long before written history dominated the record. Today we turn to early medieval Europe and to one of its most intriguing and least understood figures, Eostre, the Germanic goddess of spring and the dawn. She was celebrated in a month named in her honor. Her name survived the conversion of an entire civilization and attached itself to one of the most widely observed festivals in the modern world. And the mythology that surrounded her, though fragmentary, carried within it some of the oldest and most carefully preserved religious thinking of the Indo-European world. This episode will move through her origin, her birth, her nature, her powers, her legends, and her lasting connection to the world we still inhabit. Before we begin, if you find value in this kind of careful exploration of ancient mythology, please consider subscribing and following the channel. There are many more episodes like this one on the way. Now, let us begin. The Germanic peoples of Northern Europe maintained a sacred calendar long before Christianity reshaped their world, a cycle of seasons marked by festivals, offerings, and the veneration of divine figures whose names have mostly been lost to time. Among these figures was a goddess whose domain sat at the most critical turning point of the year, the passage from winter into spring, and the return of light after darkness. In Old English, her name was Eostre. In Old High German, the language of the Germanic tribes further south and east, the corresponding form was Ostara. The name itself descended from the Proto-Germanic word that has the meaning to shine, specifically to shine from the east. The direction east in Old English shared this same root. Her name and the direction of the rising sun were linguistically inseparable because she and the dawn were understood to be, in essence, the same thing. The earliest and most important written reference to Eostre came from the Northumbrian scholar Bede in his work De Temporum Ratione, written in 725 AD. Bede recorded that the Anglo-Saxon month Eosturmonath, corresponding roughly to April, had once been named for a goddess called Eostre, in whose honor feasts were celebrated. By Bede's time, those feasts had given way to Christian observance, but the month retained her name. This passage is the only surviving contemporary primary source to name her directly. Bede was among the most rigorous scholars of the early medieval period, and his record was accepted by later academics as a genuine account of pre-Christian religious practice rather than an invention. In 1835, the German philologist Jacob Grimm expanded the discussion considerably in his Deutsche Mythology. Drawing on Bede's account and applying the sound correspondences between Old English and Old High German, Grimm reconstructed the Old High German form of the goddess as Ostara and characterized her as a deity of radiant dawn, of upspringing light. He also noted traces in Germanic folk custom, involving hares and eggs, that he connected to a surviving spring festival tradition. No surviving Germanic text preserved a direct account of Eostre's birth. The oral tradition in which her mythology lived was not committed to writing before the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons closed that channel of transmission. What remained, however, was a combination of comparative Indo-European mythology, the internal logic of her divine character, and the structural patterns of related traditions. And from these, a picture of her origin could be assembled with reasonable confidence. In the Proto-Indo-European religious tradition from which Germanic paganism descended, the dawn goddess was typically understood as emerging from the primordial darkness itself, not created by another god, but arising from the meeting point of darkness and the first light. She is understood as the force that separated night from day, and her birth was therefore identical with the first dawn, the first moment in cosmic time when darkness was interrupted by light. It described the time before the first dawn, a primordial period of complete darkness in which the world existed but could not be seen, could not grow, and could not sustain life in any meaningful form. Eostre emerged from this darkness not as a created being but as a natural consequence of the darkness reaching its limit. The darkness had been total and complete, and then, at the moment when it had fully exhausted itself, Eostre appeared at the eastern horizon and light entered the world for the first time. This was not a violent or dramatic event in the legend's telling. It was simply the inevitable outcome of darkness running its course. She arrived, the sky changed, and the world became visible. Everything that grew, moved, or lived in the light did so because of that first appearance. Every subsequent dawn was understood as a repetition of this original event, Eostre returning each morning exactly as she had arrived the first time from the east, without announcement, as the natural consequence of night having run its course. In this understanding, Eostre was among the oldest of the divine powers, older than many of the gods whose stories were more extensively recorded, because the dawn itself preceded all else that could be seen or known or done in the world. Before moving into the full depth of her mythology, there is a connection that deserves its own dedicated space, because it is the reason most people in the modern world encounter Eostre's name at all, even without realizing it. The name of the most significant celebration in Christianity, which is Easter, came directly from this ancient Germanic goddess. Bede recorded this directly in De Temporum Ratione, noting that Eosturmonath had once honored the goddess Eostre, and that the Christian observances now took place in that same month under that same name. It was not a deliberate act of religious commemoration. It was the weight of a name so embedded in the seasonal calendar that the conversion of an entire civilization could not dislodge it. The timing of Easter reinforced the connection further. The Christian calculation of Easter, fixed to the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox, placed the festival precisely within Eostre's sacred seasonal window every year. The spring equinox was the astronomical center of her domain. The full moon nearest to that equinox was, in the broader Indo-European tradition, the great lunar marker of the spring season. The Christian festival and the goddess's festival occupied exactly the same celestial and calendrical territory. The symbols that accompanied Easter in the popular tradition also carried the marks of their origin. The decorated egg had its roots in the folk customs of Eosturmonath, connected through the hare legend to Eostre's mythology directly. The hare itself, which became the Easter bunny in later popular tradition, retained its ancient association with the goddess of spring across the centuries, even as the religious context surrounding it changed entirely. These were not Christian symbols that happened to resemble older ones. They were the older symbols, persistent in popular custom long after their theological origin had been forgotten. Eostre's powers were not the powers of war, cunning, or the storm. They governed something more fundamental, the continuity of life itself and the maintenance of the world's generative capacity across the turning of the year. Her primary power was renewal, the restoration of what winter had taken. In the theological understanding of her worshippers, winter was not simply a cold season. It was a cessation of the world's vitality. Trees died back to their roots, the earth hardened, animals grew thin, and the community endured on stored resources and hope. The return of spring was not understood as a mechanical natural process, but as a divine act, Eostre choosing again to restore what had been lost. This framing gave her festival season its particular character. Not solemn ritual, but communal celebration. Her return was an event genuinely worth marking. Her power over fertility extended across the agricultural and natural world. The soil's readiness to receive seed, the reproductive capacity of animals, the overall generative energy of the land in its most productive months. Eostre's arrival made the year's abundance possible. Connected to renewal and fertility was her authority over transformation, the ability to change one state of existence into another. This was perhaps the most mythologically significant of her powers, and it was expressed most directly in the legend of the hare, which we will examine in detail. Eostre did not merely encourage growth from a distance. She intervened directly in the natural world, reshaping what she found there according to the needs of life and the logic of her season. As a dawn goddess, her power was also intimately tied to light, specifically the growing light of the spring months, the light that extended itself further each day as the equinox approached and passed. This was not the harsh light of high summer, but the morning light, measured, increasing, promising. Each dawn was understood as a daily expression of the same power she exercised annually at the turn of the season. Her authority over liminal spaces, thresholds between states, completed the picture of her divine portfolio. Dawn was the threshold between night and day. She presides over transitions with a power that is absolute in the sense that transitions, once enacted, do not reverse themselves. When Eostre moved through the world, change followed. No symbol is more persistently connected to Eostre than the hare. Hares are most active in the early morning hours, moving through the fields in the half-light of dawn, which is precisely the time of day that belongs to Eostre. The hare lives in her hour, and so it became her animal. The hare also possesses a biological characteristic that made it particularly significant to agricultural people. It could carry 2 litters simultaneously, a phenomenon known as superfetation. To communities whose survival depended on the fertility of their animals and their land, this quality made the hare a living symbol of abundance and renewal, the same forces that Eostre herself governed. The mythology that explained this connection was preserved in the legend of the bird and the hare. During a particularly harsh winter, Eostre came across a bird that had been so badly injured by the cold that its wings could no longer function. She could not restore the bird to what it had been, so instead she transformed it into a hare, a land creature better suited to survive the conditions. The transformation gave the creature a new life, but it was not entirely complete. The hare retained the bird's ability to lay eggs. Each year, when Eostre's season returned, the hare laid its eggs at dawn and offered them to the goddess in gratitude. Over time, it began decorating those eggs before presenting them, a detail that connected directly to the folk custom of decorated spring eggs observed in the Germanic tradition. The hare, in this way, was not simply a symbol chosen to represent the season. It was a creature with a direct history with the goddess herself, one she had saved, transformed, and that returned the gift each spring in the only way available to it. The legend did not end there. In one significant variant, the hare, living now as a land animal, no longer the bird it had once been, eventually offended the goddess. The exact nature of the transgression varied across tellings: pride, ingratitude, or conduct that dishonored the gift of its transformation. Eostre's response was to cast the hare into the sky, where it became the constellation Lepus, found in the night sky directly beneath the hunter Orion. There it remained, fixed in the heavens. But Eostre granted the hare a dispensation. Once each year, at the coming of her sacred spring season, the hare was permitted to return to Earth and leave its decorated eggs as it always had. The punishment was maintained, but within it, the original act of compassion was also preserved. This version of the legend illustrated something specific about Eostre's character as a divine figure. She was not simply a gentle goddess of flowers and soft light. She was a goddess of genuine power, who could transform, punish, and pardon, and whose mercy, even when complicated, remained mercy. Beyond the legend of the hare, the mythological tradition associated with Germanic spring deities included a narrative archetype that almost certainly had its expression in Eostre's mythology: the story of the delayed spring, in which the goddess's return was somehow obstructed and the world suffered in consequence. The cause varied across the tradition. In some versions, Eostre had been detained by the forces of winter, held back by the cold that refused to release its grip on the world. In others, she had withdrawn deliberately, responding to some failure or neglect on the part of the human community to properly honor her season. Eostre's eventual return broke the suspension. The warmth came, the ice broke on the rivers, and the earth opened again. The feasts of Eosturmonath were understood partly as a response to this legend, a communal act of welcome and gratitude, ensuring that the goddess knew she was expected, that her season was being properly observed, and that the community had done its part to invite her return. Whether Eostre's specific version of this delayed spring narrative involved particular adversaries, specific trials, or a journey to another realm was not preserved in the surviving record. The mythological detail that would have answered those questions was lost in the transition from oral to written culture. Among the folk legends connected to Eostre's season, one of the most quietly told was the story of the Snow Maiden, a figure born of winter itself, and what became of her when the goddess of spring arrived. The Snow Maiden was not a malevolent figure in most tellings. She was simply a creature of winter who did not know what to do when the season changed around her. As the warmth of Eostre's arrival began to transform the world, the Snow Maiden faced dissolution. She was made of the very substance that the spring was melting away. Eostre's response to the Snow Maiden differed across versions of the legend. In some tellings, she transformed the maiden into a flower, typically the snowdrop, the first flower of spring, which bloomed in the snow and cold before any other plant dared to emerge. The snowdrop was therefore understood as the Snow Maiden's transformed self, given by Eostre a new form in which she could exist within the spring rather than be destroyed by it. In other versions, Eostre simply allowed the maiden to dissolve naturally, understanding this as the necessary cost of the season's turning, not a cruelty, but the way things were required to work. The snowdrop's association with Eostre through this legend made it one of her sacred flowers, the first visible sign of her arrival in the world, a plant that appeared before the cold had fully released its grip, and announced that the season was already turning even when the evidence was not yet obvious. Every coherent mythological tradition recorded not only the powers of its divine figures, but also their limits, because a god or goddess without boundaries was not a believable participant in a world that clearly operated under constraints. Eostre's limitations were as structurally significant as her powers. Her power was cyclical and seasonal. This was its greatest strength and its defining boundary simultaneously. She could return every year with absolute reliability, and her return was celebrated with genuine joy. But she could not abolish winter. She could not permanently defeat the forces of cold and darkness. She overcame them each spring, and then in the turning of the year, they returned. She was not the ruler of all time, she was the ruler of her portion of it. This meant that everything she renewed was subject to loss again. The flowers she called forth would eventually fade. The warmth she brought would give way to autumn, and then to cold. Her mythology did not present this as a tragedy, but as the fundamental nature of sacred time, cyclical, faithful, and necessarily repeated. The legend of the hare also embedded a subtler limitation within her transformative power. Even after Eostre remade the bird into a hare, the transformation was incomplete. The hare retained its egg-laying capacity, a residue of its former nature. This detail suggested that even divine transformation operated within certain natural laws, that the past left its mark on the present regardless of how thoroughly it was reshaped. The feasts of Eosturmonath were the communal expression of everything that Eostre's mythology meant to her worshippers, not a passive commemoration of a past event, but an active participation in the present divine drama of the season. Bede described the festival as consisting of feasts, communal gatherings in which food and celebration marked the month. He did not detail the specific ritual forms, which was consistent with his general practice of not elaborating on pagan ceremonies he considered superseded. The decoration of eggs in the spring folk tradition connected directly to the legend of the hare's grateful offerings to the goddess. In the living popular custom, this became a communal activity in which the mythological narrative was reenacted through the physical act of adorning the eggs that the season had produced in abundance. The eggs were shared between families, between neighbors, in a spirit of communal celebration of the world's renewal. The hare was a living presence in the season's observances, seen in the early morning fields as the days lengthened, and associated in folk custom with the arrival of spring in ways that preserved, however imperfectly, its original sacred connection to the goddess of dawn. The shared meal itself, the spring feast after the privations of winter, was a form of gratitude. The food on the communal table at Eosturmonath was understood as evidence that Eostre had kept her promise. Eating it together was a way of receiving that gift with acknowledgement and communal thankfulness. Eostre was a goddess whose mythology, in its full form, would almost certainly have filled a significant body of narrative. Stories of her birth from the darkness, her annual contest with the forces of winter, the creatures she shaped with her transformative power, and the divine relationships that situated her within the Germanic cosmos. None of that full mythology survived the transition from oral tradition to written record. What remained was a name, a month, a brief passage from an 8th century monk, a constellation of linguistic evidence, and the fragments of legend embedded in folk custom long after their origin was forgotten. From those fragments, however, a coherent picture emerged, a goddess born from the primordial darkness at the first dawn of the world. A deity whose power over renewal, transformation, and the growing light was real and essential to the communities that depended on the land. A divine figure whose mythology was honest enough to record the limits of her power alongside its reach, who could transform the dying bird but not perfectly, who could return each spring but not abolish winter, who could punish the hare but could not help granting it the right to return. Her name survived in the English language and in German, spoken every spring by people who do not know they are saying her name. Her symbols, the hare, the egg, the dawn fire, persisted in popular tradition long past the religion that had given them their meaning. And the season itself, the one she governed, returned each year exactly as it always had. She was the goddess of the returning light, and the light, as she always demonstrated, returns. Thank you for spending this time with Eostre's story. If this episode gave you a clearer picture of who she was and what she meant to the people who venerated her, please consider sharing it with someone who would find it worthwhile. These ancient stories reach further when people pass them on. If you are not yet subscribed or following the channel, now is a good time to do so. There are many more episodes like this one coming, each exploring another deity, another legend, and another corner of the ancient world. I would be glad to have you back for the next one. This has been the story of Eostre, the Germanic goddess of dawn and spring. I will see you in the next episode.